Imagine hearing the deep roar of a Merlin engine in the British sky, then looking up to see the famous shape of a Spitfire flying overhead. Even after 90 years, very few aircraft can create the same feeling. The Supermarine Spitfire is not simply an old fighter aircraft. It is one of the most recognizable symbols of British aviation, courage, engineering and history. In 2026, the Spitfire is receiving special attention because this year marks 90 years since its very first flight. On the 5th of March 1936, prototype K5054 took to the sky with test pilot Joseph "Mutt" Summers at the controls. That first flight lasted around 8 minutes and began the story of an aircraft that would become famous around the world. So when we talk about the 2026 Supermarine Spitfire, we are not talking about a completely new fighter aircraft entering RAF service. The modern story is about celebrating, preserving and flying the legendary aircraft that changed aviation history. In 2026, the Spitfire remains a flying piece of history, with surviving examples appearing at airshows, museums and special commemorative events. The original Spitfire was designed by Reginald Joseph Mitchell and his team at Supermarine. Mitchell had already gained valuable experience designing fast racing seaplanes, and that experience helped shape the Spitfire. The Supermarine S6B, which competed in the Schneider Trophy races, showed how speed could be achieved through clean aerodynamics and careful engineering. The S6B reached an impressive 407 miles per hour, and its design ideas helped influence the future fighter. One of the most famous features of the Spitfire is its elegant elliptical wing. At first glance, the wing simply looks beautiful, but its shape had an important engineering purpose. It allowed the designers to create a relatively thin wing while keeping the required aerodynamic performance. The result was an aircraft with low drag, excellent handling and impressive speed. The Spitfire prototype K5054 made its first flight on the 5th of March 1936. At this stage, it looked slightly different from the aircraft most people recognize today. It had a two-bladed propeller and several features were later changed. After testing, improvements were made, including a new propeller that helped raise its speed significantly. The aircraft eventually became fast enough to impress the RAF and the British government. On the 3rd of June 1936, the Air Ministry ordered 310 Spitfires. However, building the aircraft was not easy. Its stressed skin construction required high levels of precision, and Supermarine's original factory was too small to produce the aircraft in the numbers required. Production was eventually expanded, including at Castle Bromwich, where thousands of Spitfires would later be built. The first production Spitfire entered RAF service with No. 19 Squadron in August 1938. By the beginning of the Second World War, several RAF squadrons were already equipped with the aircraft. The Spitfire was soon about to face the biggest test of its life. That test came during the Battle of Britain in 1940. The German Luftwaffe launched a major air campaign against Britain, and RAF fighter pilots were sent into the skies to defend the country. The Spitfire became one of the most important aircraft in this struggle. It was not fighting alone. The Hawker Hurricane played a huge role and actually outnumbered the Spitfire during the Battle of Britain. But the Spitfire captured the imagination of the British public because of its speed, shape and ability to fight German fighters such as the Messerschmitt Bf 109. The RAF Museum describes the Spitfire as the highest performing Allied aircraft of 1940. The Spitfire Mki could reach around 353 miles per hour, climb to almost 32,000 feet and was powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine producing around 1,030 horsepower. Its original armament included 8.303-inch machine guns, 4 in each wing. But numbers and specifications only tell part of the story. Inside the cockpit, the pilot had to operate a complex machine while traveling at high speed and fighting another aircraft. Dogfights could become chaotic within seconds. The Spitfire's excellent maneuverability gave pilots confidence, but victory still depended heavily on training, awareness, tactics and courage. The RAF Museum notes that combat against the Bf 109 could depend as much on the quality of the pilot as on the aircraft itself. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine became another major part of the Spitfire's identity. Its powerful 12-cylinder design produced the unmistakable sound associated with the aircraft. As the war continued, the Merlin engine was improved and more powerful versions were introduced. Better propellers, higher octane fuel and improved engines helped the Spitfire remain competitive as enemy aircraft developed. The Spitfire also evolved dramatically during the war. There was never just one Spitfire. Different marks were created for different roles and performance requirements. The MKV became one of the most successful versions, with more than 6,500 produced between 1941 and 1943. It served on many battlefronts and was supplied to several other countries. Later versions became faster, stronger and more heavily armed. Some Spitfires were used as fighters, while others performed reconnaissance and ground attack missions. The aircraft was adapted for different climates and operating conditions, showing how flexible the original design had become. One of the final major developments was the Spitfire F-24. This aircraft used the more powerful Rolls-Royce Griffon engine rather than the early Merlin. The Griffon-powered Spitfires were very different from the original aircraft in terms of performance. The F-24 had a much greater top speed than early Spitfires and almost twice the rate of climb. Its firepower was also dramatically increased compared with the original 8 machine guns. This is one reason the Spitfire story is so interesting. It started as a lightweight, fast fighter in the 1930s and continued developing into the post-war period. The basic name and identity remained, even though later aircraft were much more powerful than the original. More than 20,000 Spitfires were eventually built. The Royal Air Force states that 20,341 were produced, making the Spitfire the most produced British combat aircraft of the Second World War era. The aircraft also had a long life after the war. The RAF's final operational Spitfire sortie was flown in 1954, showing just how far the design had progressed from the prototype that first flew in 1936. And now we arrive at 2026. 90 years after the first flight, the Spitfire is still flying. The 90th anniversary has created a special opportunity to connect the past with the present. In March 2026, the Royal Air Force and the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight announced commemorative flights involving a 2-seat Spitfire painted to represent the original K5054 prototype. The planned tour included historic locations across the United Kingdom and was designed to celebrate the aircraft's remarkable journey. For aviation fans, this makes 2026 a particularly special year. Imagine standing beside an airfield and watching a Spitfire start its engine. The propeller begins turning slowly, then faster and faster. The Merlin engine comes alive with a deep mechanical sound. Smoke and heat appear around the aircraft as it prepares for takeoff. Then the Spitfire begins moving down the runway. Within seconds, the aircraft lifts into the air. The same basic shape that first appeared in the 1930s is suddenly flying above the crowd again. That is the real magic of the Spitfire. Modern fighter aircraft are dramatically more advanced. Today's military jets use powerful computers, radar systems, advanced sensors, guided weapons and technologies that the designers of the original Spitfire could never have imagined. Compared with a modern fighter, the Spitfire is technically simple. But simplicity does not make it unimportant. In fact, its relatively simple mechanical character is part of its attraction. The aircraft gives people a direct connection with aviation history. When a preserved Spitfire flies, people are not simply watching an old aeroplane. They are seeing a machine that represents the people who designed it, built it, maintained it and flew it. The cockpit is another fascinating part of the aircraft. It is small and highly focused on the needs of the pilot. There are instruments, controls and mechanical systems packed into a limited space. The pilot sits directly in front of the engine and propeller, surrounded by the technology of another era. The famous bubble-style canopy appeared on later versions and gave pilots a much better view around the aircraft. This was especially valuable during combat because visibility could make the difference between seeing an enemy aircraft first or being surprised from behind. The wings also changed over time. Some later Spitfires used clipped wings to improve low-level performance and speed. Other versions used larger wings for high-altitude work. This ability to change the aircraft according to its mission helped keep the Spitfire useful for many years. Today, surviving Spitfires are valuable historical machines. Museums preserve them carefully, while a smaller number remain airworthy. Every flying example requires expert maintenance, specialist knowledge and considerable care. That makes every flight special. The Spitfire is also an important part of Britain's national memory. During the Battle of Britain, it became associated with the idea of defending the country against overwhelming odds. Its image appeared in newspapers, posters and public conversation. Even people who knew little about aviation recognized its distinctive shape. Over time, the Spitfire became more than a military aircraft. It became a symbol. It represents British engineering. It represents the courage of wartime pilots. It represents the huge industrial effort required to build thousands of aircraft. And for many people, it represents the wider story of Britain during one of the most difficult periods in modern history. But it is important to remember that the Spitfire was not responsible for victory by itself. The Battle of Britain was won through the combined efforts of pilots, ground crews, radar operators, controllers, engineers, aircraft factories and many others. The Spitfire was one important part of a much larger system. That makes the aircraft even more interesting. Its success was not simply about having a beautiful shape or a powerful engine. It was about bringing together aerodynamics, engineering, manufacturing, training and human skill. In 2026, that lesson remains relevant. The Spitfire shows how an idea can become something much bigger than its original purpose. Reginald Mitchell was designing a fast fighter for a rapidly changing world. He could not have known that his creation would become one of the most famous aircraft in history or that people would still celebrate it 90 years after its first flight. The original prototype K5054 is long gone, but its legacy continues through surviving Spitfires and modern commemorative projects. When a Spitfire flies today, people often stop and look. Children see history in the sky. Older generations remember stories passed down through their families. Aviation enthusiasts study every detail. Photographers wait for the perfect moment. And pilots continue the tradition of flying one of Britain's most famous aircraft. That is why the 2026 Supermarine Spitfire is not about creating a futuristic replacement for the legendary fighter. It is about keeping the legend alive. 90 years after its first flight, the Spitfire still has the ability to bring people together. It connects aviation history with modern audiences and reminds us how quickly aircraft technology changed during the 20th century. From the first flight of K5054 in 1936, through the Battle of Britain, across the many versions developed during the war, and into the post-war years, the Spitfire continued to evolve. And now, in 2026, its story continues in a different way. It continues in museums. It continues in restoration workshops. It continues in airshows. It continues in the sound of a Merlin engine crossing the British sky. Most importantly, it continues in the memories of the people who understand what this aircraft represents. The Supermarine Spitfire may be nearly a century old, but its design still looks fast even when it is standing still. Its elliptical wings, narrow fuselage, cockpit canopy and unmistakable nose give it a character that few aircraft have ever matched. Modern jets may be faster. Modern aircraft may be more advanced. But the Spitfire has something that technology alone cannot create, a story. And in 2026, 90 years after that first 8-minute flight, that story remains as powerful as ever. The Spitfire is no longer simply a fighter from the past. It is a living piece of British aviation history. Every time one takes to the sky, it gives a new generation the chance to hear the engine, see the famous silhouette and understand why this aircraft became a legend. That is the true legacy of the Supermarine Spitfire. It was born from the need for speed, shaped by brilliant engineering, tested in one of history's most famous air battles and carried forward by generations of pilots and engineers. And even after 9 decades, when that familiar shape appears against the blue sky, the world still looks up. That is the Spitfire, a machine from another age, still capable of making the present stop and remember. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe my YouTube channel.